All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our continuing education series, Joining Forces, Empowering Voices, a collaborative approach to supporting adults using high-tech AAC. My name is Erin Edwards. If you've been watching our series, you know our three key targets are building greater collaboration between BCBAs and SLPs, improving services for adults with disabilities, and expanding knowledge around the potential of high-tech AAC. Oops. Sorry, I skipped ahead here. So this CEU series is made possible through the generosity of the Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust. We are very grateful for their support and this opportunity to bring you some amazing speakers. We hope this makes a difference in your practice as a professional and in turn makes a difference in the lives of the people who you support. All of our recorded and live webinars are listed on our website. There are direct links to the webinars there or registration links for any live events that we're doing. And if you have any technical questions or issues completing the post work to get your CEUs, please use the email listed here to let us know. We could try to help you out. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Emily Gregory. Emily is an assistant professor of special education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research seeks to improve meaningful behavior outcomes for adolescents and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, her work aims to develop and test interventions to improve behavioral outcomes for adolescents and adults and identify evidence-based practices that can be implemented by natural intervention agents in authentic settings, which is something we really need as far as being able to train everybody in the environment to be a support for the individuals that we work with. So thank you so much for joining us today, Emily, and I will turn it over to you to share your screen.
Thank you so much. All right, so I just sent a request to share my screen. So here we go. All right, well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be here and to be talking about how to support communication partners for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities with behavioral skills training and supplemental supports. So today I'm going to do a quick introduction into our topic and talk about the importance of training natural interventionists, such as communication partners. I'm going to spend some time talking about behavioral skills training, or BST, and then I'm going to talk about some supplemental supports that can be used for communication partners who need a little bit of extra training support in addition to behavioral skills training. And then I'll wrap up by sharing some resources. So we have a few learning outcomes for today. The first is to be able to describe the impact of staff training on communication partner implementation of evidence-based practices. Second, you should be able to define treatment fidelity and describe methods for assessing treatment fidelity for communication partners. Third, you should be able to define and describe the components of behavioral skills training and how behavioral skills training can be used to support communication partners who work with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have complex communication needs. You should also be able to define and describe coaching procedures. And finally, define and describe in vivo feedback as a way to support communication partners. So we'll start with a quick introduction. First, I'm going to discuss the terminology that I'm going to be using in today's webinar. So when I talk about communication partners, I'm referring to frontline staff who provide direct support or communication interventions to individuals, specifically adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD. And when I discuss clients, I'm referring to individuals who receive support from a direct service provider or communication partner, or the individual who's receiving communication intervention. So we know that adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities often have complex communication needs that warrant intervention to remediate. And so we know that augmentative and alternative communication can be used to support communication among this population. And we know that there's a number of research supported practices for supporting communication, such as functional communication training, the picture exchange communication system, prompting, modeling, and other high-tech AAC devices. We know that oftentimes these communication interventions are provided by those frontline staff, such as direct service providers or communication partners. And although these communication partners are often tasked with providing evidence based communication intervention, we know that they're often given little training to do so. And we know that there's a direct link between communication partner behavior and our client communication, which is why it's so important that we provide the necessary training and supports to communication partners to make sure they're able to provide high quality evidence based communication intervention. So that's when we start focusing on implementation fidelity, or the extent to which an intervention is implemented as intended. And there's different measures of implementation fidelity that are really important when we're talking about the implementation of evidence-based practices. We can talk about adherence, or the extent to which an evidence-based intervention is implemented as it was supposed to, that all the steps were followed. We can talk about dosage, how frequently or how often the intervention was implemented, or quality, which refers to an interventionist's enthusiasm, their teaching style, and their timeliness of the intervention. But today we're really going to focus on adherence and talking about direct service providers or communication partners' ability to implement step by step implementation of evidence based communication interventions. So we know that in order to achieve adherence to these evidence based communication interventions, training is often necessary. And when we think about training, we can think of training in terms of a tiered model or different levels of training. We know that communication partners may require different levels of training or support to be able to implement evidence based communication interventions with proper adherence. So we can think about this tiered model where we have all communication partners who receive a base level of training. Some providers receive a little bit more support, and then a few providers who really receive intensive training to be able to adhere to communication procedures effectively. The idea with this tiered model is that the level of training support increases depending on the communication partner's responsiveness to the training. So if a communication partner doesn't respond to that base level of training, we can systematically increase the type of training or support that we give them in order to reach that proper level of adherence. So when we think of this tiered model at the base level of training, which is what all communication partners should receive, we can think about behavioral skills training, which we'll talk about next. At that second level of training, we can think about coaching and self-monitoring supports. And at the top of the tier, which is our most intensive level of training, we can think about in vivo feedback or in vivo training. So let's start by talking about that base level of training, which is behavioral skills training. All right, so behavioral skills training, or BST, is a systematic method for teaching new skills. And when we think about implementation fidelity, we're really focused on adherence here. So, an individual's ability to implement a communication intervention as it was intended to be implemented. And there are a few steps in the behavioral skills training process. The first step is to develop a goal for the communication partner. The second step is to implement behavioral skills training. And then the third step is to progress monitor. So, to monitor the effect of behavioral skills training on communication partner outcomes, specifically adherence, and also to monitor the effects of the training on client outcomes, specifically communication. So, the first step in behavioral skills training is to identify a goal for the related service provider or for that communication partner. And there's two ways that we can do this. We can develop the goal by observing the communication partner in the natural environment or using tools like performance checklists. When using direct observation, we can observe the communication partner in the typical setting, working with the adult with an intellectual and developmental disability. We can have a checklist of the intervention, the communication intervention we want them to implement, and we can record the number of steps that they implement correctly and the number of steps that they completed incorrectly. And then we can kind of calculate a percentage of adherence. What are the steps that the communication partner is able to do well, and what are the steps where they're needing a little bit more support? And based on that direct observation, we can tailor our training to target the steps that they're not quite able to implement correctly yet. The second way to identify goals for our communication partners are to use performance checklists. I'm going to talk about one specific performance checklist today called the Performance Diagnostic Checklist. And this is a tool that we use to identify problematic behavioral excesses or deficits that a communication partner may be displaying. And there's four main areas assessed with the Performance Diagnostic Checklist: training, task clarification, prompting resources, materials, and processes, and performance consequences, efforts, and completion. The performance diagnostic checklist is available free online, so I'm just going to show you each of those components. The first component of the checklist is training, and this goes through a few questions that you respond yes or no to that'll help you develop that goal for the communication partner. And the questions focus on: has this communication partner previously received training? Are they able to implement the communication intervention correctly at all, or the extent to which they're able to implement the communication intervention? The second piece focuses on task clarification and prompting. And this really focuses on the communication partner's ability to implement the communication intervention correctly and consistently during their work routines. So questions include: has the employee been informed that he or she is expected to perform the task? If not, we can provide supports to help the communication partner remind them that they need to implement this communication intervention more often. Next, we focus on materials, resources, and processes. And this really focuses on: does the communication partner have the necessary materials and resources they need to implement the intervention correctly? And last, we have performance consequences, effort, and competition. And so we have questions related to: does the employee ever receive feedback about their performance? Yes or no? And then we can use the answers to this question to develop a targeted goal based on the type of feedback or support that the direct service provider or communication partner needs. The great thing about the performance diagnostic checklist is it gives you potential intervention solutions for your communication partner or your direct service provider based on the responses to those questions. As you can see here in the area of training, one of the recommended practices is behavioral skills training, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. But once you complete the performance diagnostic checklist, you can move into developing a goal for the communication partner. Now, we want to make sure that just like the goals for our clients, the goals that we have for our communication partners are SMART, meaning they're specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. So I'm going to show you some example goal statements that we can create for our communication partners. So for example, by the end of the first quarter, Lois will implement functional communication training with 80% accuracy as measured by a staff-developed task list. As you can see here, this goal is specific. It's related to a single communication partner, Lois. It's measurable. We're using a staff-developed checklist. It's action-oriented. We're focusing on Lois's ability to implement functional communication training. It's realistic. We've set her performance at 80% accuracy, and it's time-bound. We have Lois meeting this goal by the end of the first quarter. A second example is: by the end of the second quarter, Mario will implement 4 to 5 steps of a visual schedule intervention correctly and independently as measured by a staff-developed checklist. As you can see here, this goal also adheres to all 5 components of those SMART goals. So we want to make sure that we develop a final or a terminal goal for our communication partners. What do we want them to be able to do at the end of our training? And so that goal might be 100% adherence, 80% adherence to an intervention, whatever is most appropriate for the intervention that you're focused on. We can also develop objectives for our communication partners, which we can think of as stepping stones that we need to meet in order to reach our terminal goal. So, for example, by the end of the first quarter, Mario will implement 2 out of 5 steps of a visual schedule intervention correctly and independently as measured by a staff developed checklist. And by the end of the second quarter, Mario will implement 3 out of 5 steps of a visual schedule intervention correctly and independently as measured by a staff developed checklist. So as you can see here, these objectives systematically increase the amount that Mario has to implement the intervention correctly before he reaches his terminal goal of 4 out of 5 steps. So we want to make sure that for our communication partners, we have a terminal goal as well as objectives that help them meet that overall goal more systematically. Once you've developed a goal for your communication partner, you can start to implement behavioral skills training. Behavioral skills training involves 4 components, and those include instructions, modeling, role play or rehearsal, and feedback. And now we're going to walk through each of these 4 steps independently and talk about what needs to be done at each level. Behavioral skills training can be implemented one time in a single training session, or it can be implemented multiple times across multiple sessions, depending on what level of support the communication partner needs. The first step of behavioral skills training is to provide instructions, and we want to provide both verbal and written instructions. When we present instructions to a communication partner, we want to make sure that we do it really systematically. So we can give our partners a checklist or essentially a task analysis of the intervention that we want them to implement. So here you can see an example checklist for implementing forward chaining to teach a communication skill to an adult with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As you can see here, each step of this task list is broken down into small and measurable parts. So the first thing is we have the service provider states the purpose of the lesson, the service provider presents an instructional cue, and the service provider performs all links in the chain except for the last link. And then we continue with the rest of the steps. But each of those steps is broken down so the communication partner can clearly understand what's expected of them. Once you provide this written checklist to the communication partner, you want to review each step of the checklist. And you want to stop after each step of the checklist to see if the communication partner has any questions. At that point, you can stop and you can clarify or provide additional information where necessary. Once you've provided instructions, the next thing you want to do is model or show the communication partner how to implement the intervention. And there's 2 ways that you can do this. You can model live in the moment, or you can provide a video model for the communication partner. Now, that video model can be a video model of you as the trainer, another direct service provider or communication partner, but you want to make sure that the video model represents somebody very similar to the communication partner. Now, when you're modeling, there's a few things that you want to consider. You want to make sure that your model is well scripted and rehearsed. You want to prevent the communication partner from making as many errors, right? We want to reduce the level of errors that they make. So we want to make sure that that model is practiced beforehand and that there's a script that the folks demonstrating are following. While you're modeling, you want to stop after each step of the model and explain what you're doing. So, describing what you're doing and also providing a rationale for why you're doing it. We know that when folks have a rationale or understand the reason why they're doing something, they're going to do it more correctly or with higher levels of adherence. So, while you're modeling, you want to stop, freeze, and explain. What am I doing and why am I doing it? You can model as many times as is necessary for the communication partner. So that's the nice thing about using a video model is that the communication partner can refer back to it as often as they need to. But both live and video modeling are effective ways to demonstrate a target communication intervention. After you provide the model, the next step is to role play or rehearse. And there's a few different ways that you can do this. You can role play in the natural setting, so the setting where the communication partner will be expected to implement the communication intervention, or you can do more of a contrived setting like an empty classroom or office space. It's up to you. Both methods are effective in this rehearsal or role play scenario. You also want to make sure that the direct service provider or that communication partner has access to the instructions that you gave them in step one so that they can systematically follow along each step of the intervention. During this role play or rehearsal scenario, you as the trainer will play the role of the client and you'll have the communication partner play the role of the interventionist. You can develop a loose script to help the flow of the role play session, or it can be more natural. But you want to make sure that that communication partner, like I said, still has access to those instructions so that they're more likely to implement the steps of the communication intervention correctly. After you've role played or rehearsed, the next step is to provide feedback to the communication partner on how they performed. And there's two types of feedback that we want to provide: supportive and corrective feedback. And both types of feedback are really important in increasing the level of adherence to the communication intervention. So, supportive feedback is acknowledging the steps of the communication intervention that the communication partner implemented correctly. And we want to make sure that this feedback is specific and descriptive. So, for example, we might say, "Excellent job providing specific praise when your client completed the task." Or, "I like the way you provided a prompt after the client had a chance to respond on his own." This is very specific feedback that acknowledges the steps of the communication intervention that the communication partner implemented correctly. After we provide that supportive feedback, we want to move into corrective feedback. And corrective feedback is when we identify the steps of the intervention that were not implemented correctly. So, for example, we might say, "Remember to provide specific phrase after the client completes his task." And then we want to give a little bit of a rationale. Providing praise will help increase the chances that the behavior will occur again in the future. So we tell the communication partner what they did incorrectly, and then we also give them a rationale for why they want to improve that behavior in the future. Another example is if your client doesn't respond 5 seconds after you provide the instructional cue, remember to give a gesture prompt. The prompt will support your client in engaging in the target behavior. So again, we've provided specific examples of what they need to improve on, and then we've given them a rationale for why they're doing it. When you're implementing behavioral skills training, you want to cycle through these four components as often as needed until the communication partner reaches their goal or objective. But most importantly, we want to focus on that role play and feedback and repeat those components as many times as is needed until the communication partner reaches their goal or objective. So once you provide feedback, you can go into another role play session and then again provide feedback and continue that cycle until the communication partner has reached their target goal. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring the communication partner's progress towards reaching their goal. And there's a really systematic way that we can do this. We can take that checklist, those instructions that we gave the communication partner at the beginning, and we as the trainer can record the number of steps that the communication partner implemented correctly and the number of steps they completed incorrectly. Then we simply divide the number of steps that were implemented correctly by the total number of steps and multiply by 100 to obtain a percentage. And that'll help us monitor progress towards that terminal goal or those smaller objectives. Once you've calculated the percentage of adherence to the target communication intervention, you can display the progress on a graph. And we'll talk about why graphing is so important in a little while. But you can see here that we can clearly visually display how the communication partner progress has changed over time. So on this graph, we have the number of sessions on the x-axis and the percentage of adherence on the y-axis. You can see that before behavioral skills training, this direct service provider was only implementing the target communication intervention with about 20% adherence. But after behavioral skills training, we see a nice steady increase until the communication partner reaches their terminal goal of 100% adherence. So we can systematically monitor their progress, and that'll help us determine which steps of behavioral skills training we need to implement again and when we can end the intervention. So, what do we know about behavioral skills training? We know that behavioral skills training can be effective in training lots of different folks, including parents, teachers, and direct and related service providers. And we know that it's one of the most well established training practices for training natural intervention agents like communication partners. So, now that you have a little more confidence in using behavioral skills training, I'm going to give you some helpful hints. One of the most important things to remember about behavioral skills training is that we want to implement all four components. We have research showing that role play and feedback may be the most effective components of behavioral skills training, but when we use all four in combination, the training procedure is much more powerful. We also want to ensure that the trainer, which is probably you as the speech language pathologist, has proficiency in the target skill. So you can also use a train the trainer model where you train other people to implement behavioral skills training, which is a great model, but we want to make sure that whoever is providing the training has real proficiency in the target skill. We also want to supplement behavioral skills training with other training components when necessary. So I'm going to switch gears into some other supplemental training procedures that you can use when that communication partner hasn't quite responded to behavioral skills training in the way that you want them to. So I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier, which is this tiered level of training. And like we said before, communication partners may require different levels of support to implement a communication intervention effectively or with high levels of adherence. So, at the base level, we can provide behavioral skills training to all of our communication partners, knowing that some of them are going to need just a little bit more support. For those individuals, we can provide two different types of support: coaching and self monitoring. And I'm going to talk about each of those next. I'm going to start with coaching because we have emerging research showing this is a very effective practice to train lots of natural intervention agents, including communication partners. Coaching is a relationship based process where an expert provides support to a novice learner to reach a shared goal. The model of coaching that I'm going to be talking about today is adapted from a model called practice based coaching, which was developed by Snyder and colleagues in 2015. And the purpose of practice based coaching was initially to improve teacher implementation of evidence based practices in early childhood classroom settings. There are three primary components of coaching. The first is goal and action planning, which is where an expert and a coachee, in this case, the communication partner, work together to develop a shared goal for improving their adherence to communication interventions. Next, we have direct observations, where an expert will observe a coachee. And finally, reflection and feedback. Now, you may notice that these components are pretty similar to behavioral skills training. The difference is in the implementation of these components. Coaching is a cyclical process that occurs over time until a coachee has achieved a goal. So, unlike behavioral skills training, which can be implemented in a single session, coaching is really a process that occurs over time. So let's talk about the foundation of coaching. The foundation of coaching is a collaborative partnership between a coach, which is in this case, probably the speech language pathologist or the other related service provider, the BCBA, and a coachee, who is in this case the communication partner. So, coaching is not an evaluative relationship, it's really a partnership between these two providers to reach a shared goal. So, before coaching can even begin, we need to make sure that there's a strong relationship or a strong foundation between the coach and the coachee. And we can just do that by establishing mutual trust and respect and developing a shared vision for your client. So, making sure that the coach and the coachee are committed to the communication success of the client. When that's the foundation of the coaching relationship, we have much more trust, respect, and are able to achieve those shared goals. The first step in the coaching partnership is to develop shared goals. And so, first, we want to select a target skill. And the target skill is the communication intervention we want the communication partner to implement. And then we want to develop a goal. And the selection of the target skill and the development of a goal are in partnership with the communication partner. So typically, when we implement behavioral skills training, the goal may be selected by you as the expert versus coaching, where we have the coachee or the communication partner actively involved in the selection of their goal. So we may give them a menu of options of what they want to work on, and the communication partner can select the target communication intervention that they feel most eager to implement or improve on. Once you've developed a goal, the next step is to develop an action plan. And an action plan is essentially a roadmap for how you reach your goal. An action plan typically includes several components, including the steps needed to reach the goal, any materials or resources that are needed to reach the goal, supplemental supports, and then thinking about what are the potential barriers to addressing this communication intervention in a natural setting, and thinking about ways that you can overcome those barriers. And then we also have a space for reflection, and I'll show you an example on the next slide. So this is a sample action plan that can be used by a communication partner. As you can see at the top, there's space for the communication partner to write down the goal that they're working on. This is a good reminder to the communication partner of what they're working towards. The next component is the steps needed to reach my goal. So in this space, the communication partner can essentially develop a task analysis for what they need to do to reach their goal. In the next box, you'll see a space that says resources I need to reach my goal. This is where we can write in things like behavioral skills training, post-it note reminders to implement the intervention, video models, or any other resources that the communication partner might need. This action plan is highly individualized, so the resources that each communication partner might need will differ based on their preferences and their skill set. In the boxes below, you see materials and supplies. So that's where you can collaborate and think about what is this communication partner really going to need in order to reach their goal. And like I said before, that could be video models, that could be post-it note reminders around the room that they need to implement the intervention. It could be markers or highlighters, making sure they have access to the communication device. Whatever they need to reach their goal, that's what we're going to put in that section. And then we have potential barriers. It's really important to think about what might hinder the communication partner from implementing the communication intervention successfully. So here, the coach and the communication partner can think about what those barriers might be. And then in the space below, they can think about what are methods to overcome those barriers. Do we need more staffing support? Do we need more video models? Do we need to make sure the staffing ratio is a certain way every day to make sure you can implement the communication intervention? But you have space there to really think about what needs to happen in order for you to reach your goal. And then the last space in this action plan is reflection. And you can see here that this last question says, how will reaching my goal improve my client's outcomes? This is really a space for the communication partner to think about the impact that this intervention is going to have on their client's communication. So, in this space, we can think about increasing independence, increasing self advocacy, right? So, we can really bring it back to that shared mission and vision, which is to improve our clients' outcomes. One of the most important things to remember with coaching is that we can layer different levels of support. So, one of the resources that you can include in an action plan is behavioral skills training. So, we can systematically include other evidence based training procedures to really maximize the efficacy of coaching. This action plan is developed during the first goal planning meeting and then revised in subsequent coaching meetings. After that action plan is developed, there's a couple of things we need to do. We need to observe the communication partner implementing the target communication intervention, and then we need to collect data on their performance. And we can collect data the same way that we collected data for behavioral skills training. But we want to make sure that after we develop our goals and we develop the action plan, that we have a dedicated time to go observe the communication partner in action. But there's a couple of guidelines that we want to think about when we go in for our direct observations. The first is that we want to determine the setting or context where you want that communication intervention to occur. And then we want to keep that observation setting consistent. So if the communication intervention is intended to be implemented during vocational training or during recreation and leisure time, we want to make sure that that observation happens in that setting or context consistently. The most important guideline to follow is to only focus on the target skill. Sometimes when we're going in to observe our communication partners, there's lots of different things we want to give feedback on. But the most important thing is that we just focus on the target communication intervention. When we narrow the scope of our observations, that's going to allow us to provide more direct, more systematic, and more descriptive feedback that helps the communication partner reach their goal. After you have observed the communication partner implementing that target communication intervention, the next thing you want to do is establish a time for reflection and feedback between you as the coach and the communication partner. The difference between behavioral skills training and coaching in terms of feedback is that we start the coaching feedback process with reflection. So the communication partner is really driving this process. So what we want to do is ask the communication partner open-ended questions that are going to facilitate reflection on their implementation of the target communication interventions. So you can prompt the coachee or the communication partner to reflect on their strengths. So what went well when they were implementing the communication intervention, and what are their areas of growth related to the target skill? So you can ask questions like, tell me what you think went well today. Tell me what some barriers were that you experienced. Or what did you do well this time? And what would you like to do differently next time? So you can see here that the communication partner is really driving that reflection process. After you've engaged in reflection, then you as the coach can provide some feedback. So you can present the data that you collected and then provide supportive and corrective feedback. So saying, I agree, these are the things that really did go super well today. And here were the steps of the intervention that we didn't implement quite correctly this time. So we have a combination of more reflection as well as targeted feedback. So how do we actually implement coaching? The first thing we want to do, like I mentioned earlier, is to establish the coaching relationship. So before you even select a goal or focus on the communication intervention you want to work on, you need to make sure that you really have a solid relationship between you as the coach and the communication partner. And as I said, that means making sure you have mutual trust and respect, and that you have a partnership versus an evaluative relationship. Next, you want to Determine a designating coaching time and context. These coaching meetings should occur a minimum of once per week. And the coaching meetings can be as brief as 5 or 10 minutes or as long as 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the context and the scope of the coaching support. But the nice thing about coaching is that the model is so flexible and it can be implemented very feasibly in context, considering those coaching meetings can be no more than 5 to 10 minutes. You want to make sure that your coaching context is separate from the direct service context. So, making sure that you can carve out space that's distraction free, where the communication partner can really have dedicated time that's focused on them versus their implementation of communication interventions. So, dedicated office space, an empty classroom, a space where, again, we can really facilitate that reflection and rich conversation that coaching relies on. We also want to make sure that you, as the coach, can schedule observations of the communication partner at least once a week. And again, these observations don't have to be long, they can be anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes or longer, depending on the target communication intervention that they're implementing. So, we want to have once a week coaching meetings and once a week focused observation sessions, and then repeat that coaching cycle until the communication partner has reached their goal. This coaching model is beneficial for so many reasons. One, we have evidence showing that it's effective in improving direct service provider implementation of evidence based practices, but it also really builds on those relationships between a coach or an expert, so you as the SLP or the BCBA, and the communication partners. Those relationships often get deteriorate over time when we don't put effort into them. And this coaching model really allows us space to pour into those relationships to ultimately improve the outcomes of our clients. All right, the next practice I'm going to talk about is self monitoring. And like I said before, self monitoring and coaching can be layered. So you can implement both of these supports simultaneously, or you can implement them separately. But self monitoring is the process of observing and recording one's own behavior. And there are a few different steps for implementing self monitoring. The first is we want to identify and define the target behavior skill. And we can do this the same way I explained for behavioral skills training, where we can do some direct observations or performance checklists, or we can do a collaborative goal development model between you, the expert, and the communication partner. Next, we want to collect some baseline data. So, how is the communication partner implementing the communication intervention before we provide any support? That's going to establish the need for self monitoring and also help the communication partner really measure their progress over time. Next, we want to develop a self monitoring system and then implement that system in practice. And then, of course, we want to engage in reflection and feedback and progress monitor. So, developing a self monitoring system is actually pretty simple. Those instructions that I showed you back when I was talking about behavioral skills training can easily become a self monitoring checklist. So, as you can see here on the left, we see each step of the communication intervention. And then on the right, we can simply leave a blank space where the communication partner can indicate whether or not they implemented a step correctly, incorrectly, or if it was not applicable. The nice thing about a self monitoring sheet like this is we have the instructions for the intervention already embedded. So the direct service provider can really closely and systematically monitor their progress. Then all the communication partner has to do is measure whether or not they implemented those steps correctly or not correctly. When we implement a self monitoring system, we want to be really systematic about where and when self monitoring is occurring. So, the first thing we want to do is identify the context or routine where the communication partner should implement self monitoring. And you want to make sure you choose the context where the communication partner is most likely to implement the communication intervention. And then you want to keep that context consistent over time. Next, you want to determine when the communication partner will self monitor. And there's two options for self monitoring. The communication partner can monitor their behavior while they're implementing the communication intervention, or they can do it after they finish implementing the communication intervention. And there's benefits and limitations of each model. It takes a lot of effort to monitor your own behavior while you're simultaneously implementing a communication intervention. So for some folks, that might not be feasible. The benefit is that your self monitoring is going to be a little bit more accurate because you're scoring your behavior in the moment. Self monitoring immediately after you implement the communication intervention is a little bit more feasible because you don't have to be doing two things at once. The drawback is that you're relying on your memory. So if you have a memory like mine, that might not be the best option. But typically, these communication interventions are happening pretty quickly, and your recollection of what happened is still relatively accurate. You also want to make sure that that self monitoring sheet only relates to the target communication intervention and only focuses on that intervention. So, although there are other areas the communication partner might want to improve upon, you want to make sure that that self monitoring sheet only lists the step for the target communication intervention. And then finally, you want to determine a context for reflection and feedback. And that reflection and feedback should occur about once a week between you as the expert and the communication partner. One step of self monitoring that we really want to make sure that we implement is to graph the communication partner's adherence to the target intervention. Each week, the communication partner can graph their progress and observe how their behavior is changing over time. This is really what makes self-monitoring so effective is that you're able to examine what you're doing and then make changes based on how you're responding to the self-monitoring program. So as you can see here, we have the same graph. We have before self-monitoring, the communication partner's implementation and their adherence to the communication intervention was very low. Once we started implementing self-monitoring, we see a nice steady increase in the adherence to that communication intervention. So each week you can review this graph. You can do this on graph paper, make your graph by hand so that the communication partner can observe changes in their behavior in real time. So although coaching and self-monitoring are very effective interventions for teaching communication partners new skills, we still know that some communication partners will require even more support. So the last support I'm going to talk about today is called in vivo feedback, or that kind of in the moment on the job training. So in vivo feedback is in the moment support that we provide to a communication partner from an expert. And we can provide lots of different types of support, but often in the moment, we're providing a review of instructions, we're providing prompts or reminders to the communication partner of what they should be doing. We can provide modeling in the moment, or we can provide in the moment feedback, both supportive and corrective. So here are some guidelines for implementing in vivo support. Just like coaching, you want to make sure that you have a really well established relationship between yourself and the communication partner before you provide in vivo support. Without that relationship, the in vivo support feels more evaluative than it does collaborative. So you can blend some of these elements of coaching with in vivo feedback and making sure that you have a shared vision, mutual respect, and trust before you start to provide that in vivo feedback. Next, you want to determine a mutually agreed upon time and context for the observations. So just like coaching, you want to make sure with in vivo support that you're visiting the communication partner at least once per week. And like the other methods, we want to make sure that we're only focused on that target skill. After you provide that in the moment feedback, so you're providing this feedback while the communication partner is implementing the communication intervention with their client, you want to set aside some time. Again, this can be 5 to 10 minutes of reflection and feedback. This is where you again facilitate reflection and ask the communication partner to reflect on what went well, what didn't go so well, and to provide that supportive and corrective feedback again. There are additional supplemental supports that you can use to support communication partners' implementation and adherence of various communication interventions. A couple that we didn't talk about thoroughly, but I'll just touch on very briefly, are video feedback, group coaching, and technology mediated supports. So, video feedback is when you record the communication partner implementing the communication intervention and actually show them the video of their implementation. We have lots of research showing that video feedback can be effective in increasing adherence to a number of evidence based interventions. Video feedback can also be layered into coaching or in the moment in vivo supports, depending on how you want to use it. It's also important to note that these coaching procedures can be used individually or in groups. One of the challenges we face when we're working in adult service settings is staffing. And sometimes it can be very unrealistic to implement these coaching procedures one on one. So it's important to remember that you can implement coaching with a small group of communication partners as opposed to doing it in a one on one context. Last, you can also use technology mediated supports. For some individuals, that in vivo support can feel very intrusive. So you can also use models like bug in the ear coaching, where you simply call the communication partner and provide in the moment feedback that way, as opposed to standing directly next to them. So these are just some additional supports that you can consider as you're training your communication partners. I went over a lot of different resources and supports and training procedures today. And so I want to make sure that you have resources to be able to utilize these supports in practice. So, what I've done is created a Google Drive folder that has sample action plans, links to different videos and overviews of coaching procedures, and practitioner articles on how to implement behavioral skills training in practice. So, if you follow this link, it'll open you up to a Google folder of all the different resources on the different topics that I've covered today. And if you have any questions about any of the training procedures that I talked about today, please don't hesitate to email me at egregory@uic.edu. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today and hope that these procedures are helpful as you train communication partners in the future.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Sure.
Um,
Sorry, I talked a little
I
faster than anticipated.
That's okay. Well, I have a question. I was thinking about the training, and you mentioned like a train the trainer model.
Yes.
But I think, I know here in Pennsylvania, we just deal with regular turnover, so we have a lot of staff coming in that really don't, like you mentioned, don't have the resources and the skills, but then a lot of turnover. Have you found train the trainer to, I guess, be a help to that, or any other ideas of like how do we keep the training in the system even if staff are leaving?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think capitalizing on technology mediated support, so like video feedback, building a library bank of videos of communication partners implementing communication interventions so you can utilize video modeling or really enhance that component of behavioral skills training can be really effective. I also really like coaching because it really focuses on the relationship. And we have
Mm.
some research showing the effects of coaching on actually having people feel more satisfied in their employment setting, which may reduce some of that burnout and turnover that you experience. But I really like using those technology mediated supports, specifically building banks of videos of communication partners implementing these interventions, which then we can use with new staff that are coming in and out all the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great idea, to have that. Yeah, my other thought was the buy-in, which I really like the coaching model for that too. Um, sometimes I think it's just again lack of experience and exposure to the field, but people maybe are have a limited view of what the individual that are supporting would be able to do.
Mhm.
So they assume kind of incompetence versus competence.
Right.
So sometimes they don't buy into doing the interventions that we really want them to. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the thing I love about coaching is the first step is developing that shared vision for the client. And I think that's a really great time where both the expert, the coach, and the communication partner can be really honest about what they expect of the client. And that can be a really good time to talk about expectations and the importance of presuming competence. And when you have that conversation, it becomes a lot easier to develop goals because you're kind of on the same page about what our outcomes are for this person. So I think giving space in that coaching relationship to have really honest conversations about what we expect of people can be really helpful in setting a really solid foundation for the coaching relationship. And also you can also give, the communication partner, like, a menu of options of things they can work on. So, like you were saying, a lot of times our communication partners just don't have a lot of knowledge of the field or even what's possible for the clients that we're working with. So, kind of giving them a menu of things to choose from and see what they gravitate to, what they feel comfortable with, what aligns best with their vision for the client can help kind of get that buy-in, and help them think differently about how they might be supporting this client.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Because I think sometimes we forget that step entirely and just think, well, this is your job, so you're going to do it,
Right.
without really getting that connection piece that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Thank you so
If we have
much.
a few minutes, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Hey, thank you, Emily. This is great. This is incredibly important. I'm sure you've observed this as well, and I suspect in part this is sort of where this line of interest was born out of. Um, I think we've all seen so many times where like excitement and good intention maybe gets ahead of laying the groundwork for achieving the most meaningful gains. So I could see a team, and I've observed this, get really excited, put the communication system in place, uh, kind of hoping for miracles, but not necessarily like laying the foundational work of like, all right, we got to train everyone around this individual we're supporting, so that we know the ways to communicate. So this is kind of big, a philosophical question. Sort of suggestions to the audience. For in the moment, how to not fall into the trap of let's just get this in the hands of someone and hope for the best. We could do that, but then sort of making sure that we lay the groundwork and we provide meaningful coaching and meaningful training for the individuals in our clients' environments, so that we could be better communication partners.
Yeah, that's such an important question. I think a lot of it comes down to that goal development phase and thinking about what's really the outcome that you want to see. And sometimes it's we want the communication partner to implement something more correctly. So focusing on adherence. But sometimes it's we know how to do this, it's just not happening consistently enough or often enough. And so designing really targeted goals that focus on what's the thing we really want to change here. The other thing I really like about that coaching procedure is in the action plan, focusing on the potential barriers. I think so many times you're exactly right. We get really excited. We are saying we're going to put this communication intervention in place and we're going to see these great improvements, but we don't have open conversations about what the barriers are. And so I think having that conversation about, we have a lot of turnover, or the house manager is changing, or our staffing is off one day. So having really honest conversations about what the barriers are and then designing supports that align with those barriers can really help reduce some of the
Yeah.
challenges we experience. So I think just putting a little more time into the goal development process, and sometimes the goal is just, we all need to develop a shared vision together. Sometimes we just have to go back to the basics. So, not forgetting about those foundational pieces before we jump too quickly into just putting the intervention in place. So, I really like coaching because it can be used not only to improve adherence, but also to think about quality and dosage and developing this vision, those foundational pieces that we really need to put in place.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's really helpful. It's the kind of thing I imagine you would recommend that clinical teams, support teams, like you carry this with you at all times. So you kind of avoid that trap of sort of there's a very old school classic article in behavior analysis. I know some of you are going to be familiar with it, where it talks about the need for explicit generalization programming. And and the authors describe sort of the traditional approach as being one of like pray and hope.
Yeah,
and and we want to have that hope, and that's great. That optimism is great. But what we've learned in sort of any attempts, in most attempts to sort of change behavior, to help prompt, to help teach, it's really important to be systematic, to have plans, to have programs that we could fall back on. And I think it's such an important message that the communication partners, they need this. Um, they they would benefit from some instruction, some skills about how to be the best communication partner possible.
absolutely. And that's the thing I love about coaching is that it really gives the communication partner a voice, which I
Mm.
think so often we don't have their buy-in because they don't feel like they have a voice. So giving them the space to talk about what's important to them, and they know the clients so well. They're with them most of the time. So to be able to kind of elevate their voices and say, this is what I think is happening, I think does help support generalization and taking that communication intervention from the home into the community into the workplace. But yeah, kind of centering their voices in this process, I think makes a world of difference.
But thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. And please check out our website or within the learning management system for some other CEUs. Thank you very much. Have a great day.